death of Hugh Despenser the Younger was not an end, it was a carefully orchestrated sermon written in blood and bone. What transpired in the autumn of 1326 was far more than a mere punishment for treason. It was a grotesque ritual, a public exorcism of a man who had become a national disease. His execution was a calculated act of erasure, designed to obliterate not just his body, but his very identity and legacy from the annals of England. It was a curse, meticulously crafted to resonate through the ages, a chilling testament whispered from beneath a tarnished crown. Hugh Despenser held no royal blood, he wore no crown, and yet, in the decaying years of King Edward II's reign, he was the undisputed sovereign of England in all but name. He was the king's consuming shadow, a presence that was at once everywhere and untouchable, a figure who drew the deepest wells of resentment from a beleaguered nation. His official crimes were a litany of high medieval sins: treason, sodomy, piracy, and systemic corruption. But the unspoken truth of his condemnation was infinitely more perilous. Hugh Despenser was not led to the scaffold because he had violated the kingdom's laws. He was torn apart because he himself had become the law, a singular and arbitrary power accountable to no one. When the machinery of the state he had so masterfully commanded finally turned against him, there was no pretense of a trial. There was only a performance, a macabre piece of theater for a kingdom starved of justice. Bound in the very irons he had once used to shackle his own enemies, he was paraded through hostile streets, a fallen idol delivered to the jeers of a populace he had helped to bleed dry. His downfall was not a simple political collapse, it was a grand, horrifying spectacle. And to truly comprehend why an entire kingdom would erupt in celebration as his organs were carved from his living body, we must first journey back to the heart of the rut, to a crumbling throne, a king lost in his own court, a queen silenced for far too long, and a man whose ambition was a fire that sought to consume the heavens themselves. To the casual observer at court, Hugh Despenser the Younger might have seemed unremarkable. He was a nobleman by birth, the son of a respected royal servant, and had made an advantageous marriage to the king's own niece, Eleanor de Clare. His lineage was solid, his connections impeccable, but not extraordinary in a court teeming with ancient and powerful families. Yet, hidden beneath the veneer of polished courtly manners and disarming charm lay a nature far more volatile and predatory. Here was a man whose boundless ambition was fused with a sharp, calculated intelligence, all untethered by any recognizable moral restraint. Greatness was not his birthright, it was a summit he would reach by clawing his way over the bodies of his rivals, friend and foe alike. He arrived at the center of a kingdom already in a state of advanced decay. By the early 1320s, England was hemorrhaging. King Edward II, a man plagued by indecision and a preference for low-born favorites over his own warrior nobility, was regarded with a contempt that barely veiled itself. His court was a viper's nest of factionalism, a paranoid world of shifting allegiances where whispers in corridors held more weight than royal decrees. Into this vortex of chaos stepped Hugh Despenser, not as a stabilizing force or a voice of reason, but as the ultimate puppet master, ready to pull the strings of a broken kingdom. Despenser's influence over Edward was not that of a mere advisor, it was a complete and total absorption. He did not simply counsel the king, he consumed him, becoming the mind that directed the king's hand and the will that animated the royal seal. The spoils of this intimate power were immeasurable. Lands, titles, fortunes, and, most crucially, legal immunity. He claimed them all, not through the overt force of a sword, but through the silent poison of schemes, forged documents, and manipulated laws. He weaponized the very authority of the crown for his personal enrichment and vengeance. Rivals were not just defeated, they were exiled and ruined. Inheritances of powerful families were seized on flimsy pretexts. The machinery of royal justice was transformed into a private engine of plunder. Under the chilling shadow of Despenser's influence, the monarchy ceased to be a public trust. Power was no longer about the governance of a realm, it was about the absolute ownership of it, and Hugh Despenser had no intention of ever sharing his prize. With each passing year, his grip became a stranglehold. He did not simply participate in government, he devoured the state apparatus until he and the state were indistinguishable. He controlled the flow of all information, intercepting foreign correspondence before it reached the king and penning Edward's own decrees to perfectly align with his insatiable ambitions. Royal policy was no longer debated, it was dictated by Hugh. Parliament, once the council of the realm, was reduced to a hollow formality, a rubber stamp for a tyrant's will. The anointed king, Edward II, became a pathetic figurehead in his own court, his authority systematically drained, his will completely subjugated. Those who dared to speak out against the Despenser regime simply vanished. Some were thrown into dungeons without trial, others faced trumped-up charges leading to execution, and many were just never seen again. This was not the chaotic violence of a brute, it was the cold, strategic violence of a master manipulator. Every imprisonment, every seizure of land, served a single, chilling purpose, to demonstrate that resistance to Hugh Despenser was not merely punished. It was utterly and irrevocably obliterated. Even the most absolute predator can misjudge the prey. At the center of the web of power and fear stood Hugh Despenser, an untouchable colossus, but he had made a fatal error. He had targeted the one person whose humiliation would catalyze the entire kingdom's rage, Queen Isabella. Once a respected and loyal consort to her husband, Isabella of France had been systematically dismantled by Despenser's paranoia. He saw her not as a queen, but as a rival focus of loyalty. Her French household was dismissed, her lands confiscated, her children used as political pawns, their access to their mother controlled by Hugh himself. The woman who by right sat beside the throne was rendered a ghost in her own court, a silenced, powerless spectator to the plundering of her husband's kingdom and the poisoning of his mind. Stripped of her dignity, her voice muted, her role reduced to that of a pawn in Hugh's merciless game, she was pushed into the shadows. But in those shadows, hatred took root and hardened into resolve. Despenser, in his arrogance, had profoundly underestimated the queen. He had forged his own reckoning. While Despenser fixated on consolidating his power, the kingdom he was bleeding dry began to die. By 1325, England was a land on the brink of collapse. A series of devastating famines had left the common folk starving in the fields, while the royal court, under Despenser's direction, grew grotesquely fat on confiscated estates and stolen wealth. Taxes soared to impossible heights, not to fund wars or build cathedrals, but to line the pockets of the king's favorite and his cronies. The nobility, whose ancient pact with the crown was built on mutual respect and counsel, now whispered in secret, their loyalty curdling into a mixture of dread and loathing. Even the institution of Parliament, the nascent voice of the nation, found itself locked out of power, its functions usurped, its relevance suffocated by the absolute and suffocating reach of one man. The kingdom was a powder keg, and it was not the starving peasants or the mutinous barons who would provide the spark. It was the humiliated queen. The opportunity came disguised as diplomacy. Sent to her native France to negotiate a treaty with her brother, King Charles IV, Isabella tasted freedom for the first time in a decade. And she never returned. In exile, the ghost of a queen became the architect of a rebellion. She became a symbol for all the dispossessed and disillusioned, a rallying point for a nation's hatred of the Despensers. And at her side, she found the perfect instrument for her vengeance, Roger Mortimer. A powerful marcher lord, Mortimer had been one of the Despensers' earliest victims, his lands stolen and he himself thrown into the Tower of London to rot. In a daring escape, he had fled to France, a man with a deep and personal score to settle. He became Isabella's champion, her military commander, and, it was whispered across Europe, her lover. Together, they defied Edward's furious demands for her return and began to raise an army. It was not a vast host of peasants, but a shrewdly assembled force of mercenaries and English nobles who had been exiled or ruined by the Despenser regime. Their stated goal, broadcast with calculated precision, was not to dethrone a king. Not yet. Their singular, declared target was the tyrant who had hijacked the throne, Hugh Despenser. When their small fleet landed on English shores in September 1326, something extraordinary and telling happened. Nothing. There was no royal army to meet them. There was no heroic defense of the king's favorite. Instead, the country held its breath and then exhaled in a collective sigh of welcome. The name Despenser had become poison. The rebellion of 1326 did not spread with fire and sword, it spread like a silent, unstoppable tide. The power that Hugh had built on a foundation of fear and intimidation proved to be a house of cards. The moment a viable alternative appeared, his authority did not just slip, it evaporated. Cities and towns opened their gates to Isabella and Mortimer without a single arrow being fired. Powerful nobles and even the king's own household knights switched their allegiance without a fight. The man who was once feared across the entire realm now found himself utterly, terrifyingly alone. The fall was as swift as the rise had been meticulous. King Edward II and Hugh Despenser fled London, not as monarchs leading an army, but as desperate fugitives, stripped of resources, allies, and dignity. There would be no climactic battle, no glorious last stand. There were no loyal legions left to command. There was only a panicked, humiliating flight across the lands they had once owned, hunted by the queen they had scorned. Finally, in South Wales, near the Despenser heartlands that had once been their fortress, they were captured. Hugh was not found on a battlefield, sword in hand. He was discovered disguised and cowering in a monastery, filthy, skeletal, and clad in a simple monk's robe, begging for a sanctuary that would never be granted. He was dragged from his hiding place, bound in heavy chains, and presented to the very people who had once bowed before him, now a broken trophy of their liberation. As news of his capture spread, the kingdom erupted. Bonfires were lit in the streets of London. Church bells, once silent in fear, now rang out in joyous celebration. The entire nation exhaled, not with a sense of quiet relief, but with a raw, primal cry for vengeance. For what awaited Hugh Despenser was not to be a trial in any recognizable sense. Isabella and Mortimer did not seek legal closure, that was a luxury for lesser crimes. They sought a warning. They needed to craft a message of absolute consequence, one written not on parchment, but carved into the living flesh of their enemy for all of history to see. Hugh Despenser would not be punished as a common traitor. He would be systematically and publicly unmade, like a curse being purged from the land. When Hugh Despenser was finally seized in October 1326, he was a mere phantom of the man who had once ruled from the shadows of the throne. Starving, filthy, and trembling with a terror that was now his only companion, his downfall was more than just a military or political defeat, it was a total symbolic collapse. Gone were the fine silks, the furs, and the legions of courtiers who hung on his every word. Now, he was clad in rags and bound in chains, treated not as a fallen nobleman, but as livestock destined for slaughter, locked away in the very cages he had once so callously filled with his enemies. His death did not begin on the gallows. It began with a meticulously staged ritual of humiliation, designed to strip away his humanity layer by layer. He was paraded through the towns on the journey to his final destination at Hereford, displayed as a broken and pathetic relic of tyranny. In a gesture intended to publicly emasculate him, his beard was crudely shaved off. His own clothes were torn from his back and replaced with a coarse, black tunic bearing his personal coat of arms reversed, the ultimate mark of a traitor. For the final leg of the journey, he was tied onto a common packhorse, but facing backward, forced to stare at the animal's tail, an act of profound mockery that transformed him from a feared prisoner into a pitiful public spectacle. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that he wept openly, a broken man vomiting in fear when he was finally told the precise manner of his impending death. This was not a court of law, it was a staged descent into hell, and Isabella, his great enemy, was its master architect. At Hereford, the temporary seat of Isabella and Mortimer's power, the kingdom's nobles gathered. They did not come to dispense justice, they came to bear witness to a reckoning. There was no jury, no presentation of evidence, no chance for a defense. A list of theatrical charges was read aloud: treason, sodomy, theft, piracy, sorcery, and then the sentence was pronounced. But death was only the prologue. The scaffold itself was an instrument of propaganda. It was built deliberately high, a massive platform of wood soaked in pitch so that the crimson of his blood would show more clearly against the black surface, visible to every soul in the enormous crowd. It was not an execution block, it was a stage, and Hugh Despenser was the star performer in a gory passion play of pure vengeance. They did not begin with a swift blade, but with a rope. Hugh was hauled up and hanged, but he was not allowed the mercy of a quick death. The rope was just tight enough to make him choke, to make his body flail and convulse as he dangled at the very edge of consciousness, a puppet in their control. Then, gasping and twitching, they cut him down and laid his barely living body upon the platform for the true horror that was yet to come. The knives appeared next. First, the executioner sliced off his genitals, the instruments of his lineage. They were held aloft as a grotesque trophy for the screaming crowd to see, before being cast into a waiting fire while his fading eyes were forced to watch. It was an act of symbolic erasure, the destruction of his masculinity, his future, his entire bloodline. Next, the executioner's blade opened his abdomen, slowly and deliberately. Inch by agonizing inch, his intestines were drawn out from his body, still warm, still pulsing with the last vestiges of life, and they too were thrown into the same fire. He remained conscious through much of it, his mind flickering in and out of the unimaginable agony, his eyes reportedly locking onto Queen Isabella, who watched from a platform, not with a plea for mercy, but with an expression of stark, uncomprehending disbelief. This was not execution, it was a political vivisection performed in the open daylight. Even then, his death was not permitted to come quickly. After the disembowelment, an axe was used to split his chest open. His ribs cracked under the blows, and finally, his heart, the very seed of his treasonous ambition, was cut out and also thrown into the flames. Only then, after he had been comprehensively unmade, was his life finally extinguished. But the sentence had not yet ended. His body was not buried, it was treated as state property to be used for one final, chilling message. His corpse was decapitated and then hacked into quarters. His arms and legs were severed from his torso and carefully wrapped in cloth. Each piece was dispatched to a different corner of the realm, to Bristol, Dover, York, and Newcastle, major cities where his influence had once been absolute. Now, they received his flesh as a grisly warning, nailed to the city gates for all to see. His head, crowned in dried blood and twisted in a permanent mask of agony, was sent to London and mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, the capital's great gateway. Every person who entered or left the city, merchants, pilgrims, nobles, and commoners, would pass beneath it. It was a visceral piece of state propaganda, a lesson carved into skin and bone. Power seized without restraint will be repaid in iron and fire. There was no tomb, no prayer, no forgiveness, only scattered fragments and an enforced silence. As Despenser's limbs were being nailed across England, King Edward II, the man he had served, controlled, and ultimately destroyed, sat silently in captivity. Stripped of his crown and his dignity, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III, in a cold, public ceremony he was not even permitted to attend. He had become irrelevant. Less than a year later, in September 1327, Edward was declared dead in his prison cell, officially from natural causes. But the whispers told a different story, a story of a red-hot poker, of muffled screams behind stone walls, of a murder designed to leave no outward marks of violence. Whether legend or truth, his end was as quiet and shadowy as Despenser's had been loud and spectacular. With it, the regime of corruption and favoritism came to a shamed and whispered end. His enemies tried to delete Despenser from history itself, scrubbing his name from records and chronicles. But history resists such simple erasure. Hugh Despenser returned, a ghost in the archives, not as a simple villain, but as a dark reflection of a kingdom that had rotted from the head down, a timeless and terrifying warning of what happens when one man's ambition is allowed to outrun all restraint.